Okay, let's get going. Sorry, we're a bit late. We are actually waiting for one more person to arrive, Khaled Mahmood, who seems to be running a bit late. My name is David Goodhart, and I run the quiet please. I run the demography unit here at Policy Exchange. And I think this is probably the first event we've actually had on demography the whole time I've been running the demography unit. We've written about a lot of other very interesting things, but this is undoubtedly an event on demography, demographic futures. And it stars two gentlemen who have written books recently on the subject. Topping the bill is Paul Morland, who some of you may have heard on Start the Week this morning, he spoke very well on that programme. And I hope not too many of you actually heard the programme, because he's probably going to recycle a lot of what he said on Start the Week. And Paul has just written this book called The Human Tide, How Population Shaped the Modern World. And it is a really fascinating sort of bluffer's guide to demography. A really, really useful overview of this subject that is central to human society and development. And it's rather remarkable in some ways that a book like that had not, to my knowledge anyway, been written before. Anyway, he's plugged that hole, and he is going to talk for 10 minutes, and then Eric Kaufmann is going to also talk for 10 minutes about his own book on demography, Whiteshift, Populism, Immigration and the Future of White Majorities. Eric is more of an expert on the sort of the ethnic aspect of demography. His book is it actually came out towards the end of last year. is a pretty controversial theme, but he's survived in one piece so far. We'll see what you can do to him. Anyway, he will also speak for 10 minutes on his contribution to this debate, and we then have rather a large number of respondents. In fact, a higher than replacement level of fertility number of respondents. 3. David Willett, who you will know, former cabinet minister, and to his right, Lionel Shriver, the author and journalist. Lionel, you reviewed Paul's book in The Spectator, I think, so you count as an expert on demography.
And I reviewed it well, or I wouldn't be here.
Yeah. Anyway, and we are expecting, as I say, Khaled Mahmood, who is, as well as, like David, being from Birmingham, MP for Birmingham Perry Barr, is also the Shadow Minister of State for Europe. I'm not quite sure how that makes him an expert on demography, but we will wait and see. Anyway, without further ado, why don't we start with Paul, and then Eric, and then the 3 respondents, and then hopefully we will still have time for comments and questions from you, the audience. Thank you very much. Over to you, Paul.
Thank you, David. I'll stand here, yeah. Okay. Thank you very much, David. So The Human Tide is proving a difficult book to categorise. It was reviewed in Nature as one of 5 scientific books you should read this week, which sounds rather a lot. And indeed, Waterstones shelved it under popular science, which was a great laughing point for my children, 2 of whom are here, who keep reminding me that I may have written a book supposedly on popular science, but I am neither popular nor a scientist. The first of those contentions is debatable, the second is undeniable. So I do not consider it a work of popular science or any kind of science. I do consider it a work of history, however. But although it's really a book about the past, everyone who I meet and broadcast with wants to talk about the future, or at least the present. And this morning on Start the Week was fairly typical of that. They want to talk about Trump, not about Thomas Malthus. They want to talk about Brexit, not the foundations of the British Empire. And indeed, tonight is billed as being about the demographic future. However, I would like partly to talk in my limited 10 minutes, partly to talk about the past and to talk about history for 2 reasons. First of all, as I said, that is what the book's about. Secondly, I think if you take the subtitle of the book, How Population Shaped the modern world, past tense, historic, if you understand how population shaped the modern world, I think you will be better equipped to understand how it is shaping it and how it will shape it in the future. So I'd like to talk briefly about the basic mechanisms of demography working through history. And for anyone who did listen to me on Start the Week this morning, apologies. Some of this will be familiar, but not everything that follows. So the way I do this is I tend to talk about four queens who I think personify, in this country anyway, the demographic transition we have experienced. We start with Queen Anne, who I write about in my book, not knowing she was suddenly going to become the subject of Hollywood fame. And Queen Anne, as you probably know, had 17 pregnancies, and none of her children survived her. And those were the days that we as humans bred like rabbits and died like flies. That was demographic history forever, and that's what Thomas Malthus describes. Now, that's a huge simplification of millennia of demographic history, but broadly, that was the way the world was. We had lots of people being born, lots of people dying. Populations were quite small and never got very much off the ground. We only had 1 billion people in 1800 globally, which is 4 times what it had been at the time of Julius Caesar, but very low nevertheless. Very slow growth over 2 millennia. We then have Queen Victoria, 9 children, all survived her. We were still breeding like rabbits, but we were no longer dying like flies. Lots of arrivals in the nursery, not many departures to the graveyard, result, booming population. And for Britain, that meant workshop of the world and colonial settlements in Canada and Australia, very crudely. We then get on to the Queen Mum, 1920s, typical nuclear family, 2 children, both of whom survived, at least one to reasonable old age and one to extreme old age. And we thought we were through the transition. We thought we'd now passed to low fertility, low mortality, large but stable population. And then, surprise, surprise, we had a post-war baby boom, very nicely exemplified by our own Queen with her 4 children. Where did that come from? But they, in turn, have only had just about replacement fertility among them. And our economies, meanwhile, have been sucking in voraciously, a voracious need for labour in our economies, which has resulted in mass immigration, enormous ethnic change, and a lot of the populist backlash we see today. And that's the story of Britain, similar stories in France, similar stories in the United States. But that transitional process has been happening in many different places at different times. And the whole theme of the book is how the different process, same process starting at different times in different places, with populations first expanding and then contracting in one place and then another, has driven so much of history. So I just want to give you 3 very brief examples of the kind of history it has driven. First of all, some people thought Napoleon was a fool to sell the huge area of the Louisiana Purchase, the sort of central part of what is now the continental United States. But in fact, the Americans at that point, in the first decade of the 19th century, outnumbered the French settled in Louisiana by 100 to 1. So they were going to roll over that space regardless. At least he got something for it. And similarly, 40 years later, the 1848 war with Mexico, the Americans were a burgeoning population. They were going to roll over that area. There were hardly any Mexicans or Spaniards there. And in the case of America, there was talk of manifest destiny in the 19th century to roll across the continent. That truly was a case of destiny being demography and demography being destiny. Second statistic I would cite, the ratio of Americans to Brits by 1940, 3 to 1. Now, back at the era of the Civil War in America in the 1860s, the populations were even. How could it be, if Americans were just as prosperous, if not more, and just as dynamic, if not more, than the Brits, but there were 3 times as many of them, how could it not be that they would eclipse the power of the British Empire? And so, actually, if we look at both Russia, stroke Soviet Union, and America in the interwar period, actually from about 1900, they take off, where the great powers, traditional great powers, Britain, France, Germany, etc., stay behind demographically. Something de Tocqueville had actually forecast back in the 1830s, that these 2 enormous powers would expand because they could house so many more people. And so, in many ways, I think it was demography that gave us the era of the superpowers at the end of the era of the great powers. And finally, on the past, and I'm going to come very briefly to the future, finally on the past, or actually the present, the median age of Catalonia is about 43, 44. And I went there recently. I was sitting in a town called Portbou looking around and thinking, these people may vote for independence, Madrid may send in the troops, and there may be a few clashes in the streets in Barcelona, but all these 60-somethings sitting and drinking their coffee are not going to kick off a civil war. And actually, if you look at other cases, Lebanon, it had its civil war in the 70s, median age 20. Syria, it had its civil war recently, median age 20, but Lebanon now has a median age of 30. And with all the same pressures, the same sects, the same external forces working in Lebanon, Lebanon has just about held the line, I think because the people are 10 years older and wiser than they were back in the 70s. You can tell a similar story about the Balkans in the 90s versus now, and about many other places. So to wrap up, I will, however, talk about the future, which is what we're here to talk about. And in the book, I talk about the three colours of the future: more grey, more green, and less white. In terms of more grey, practically every country in the world is now ageing. Some have a median age of 20, some have a median age of 46, but they're all moving in the same direction. I've already said that is good news in terms of civic peace, in terms of civil war, and I would say that the ageing of Europe has been a major contributor to the fact that we've had such a peaceful era outside the Balkans since 1945, perhaps more than more responsible for that peace than the institutions of the European Union. Which is not a comment on Brexit. So more grey. The bad news there, as we all know, is that has huge economic welfare state issues. More green. I'm not saying there are no environmental issues. Far be it from me. That'd be completely false. But I do think as global population growth starts to slow, as we all move into the era of the Queen Mum or her grandchildren, effectively, and we're now in a position where global population growth is growing 1% a year. Back in the 70s, it was 2% a year. So imagine instead of doubling every 35 years, it's doubling every 70 years, roughly. And that takes a huge amount of pressure off the environment. And in many places, we are seeing populations falling from Bulgaria to Japan, populations urbanizing, and a lot of space returning to nature, wolves and bears returning to places they haven't been for decades, if not centuries. And finally, less white. And on that, I'll simply give you the statistic that in 1950, the population of Europe to sub-Saharan Africa was 2 to 1. By the end of this century, it will somewhere be like somewhere between 4 to 1 and 6 to 1 in favour of sub-Saharan Africa. And that, of course, is in a situation where Europe is much less European than it was in 1950. There will be many people who are non-European origin in Europe. And Africa, of course, is much more African because the relatively small European populations in Algeria and South Africa will either disappeared entirely or very largely. And my argument is this will be a very different world. However, of course, as the world becomes less white, the very nature of whiteness will change. That's a subject which I will defer to my friend, colleague and guru, Eric Kaufmann on, which he's far more qualified to talk about than I am.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, Paul. I'm not sure about the guru part, but I'll take it. So yeah, I mean, my book also has a strong demographic aspect, and one of the things I like about Paul's book is it's not just about the population shifts, but it's also about how perceptions of population change. When people thought the Germans were expanding and thought of them as more of a threat, then they moved in to try and cut off that threat. So it's also about perceptions of demography. And when I'm talking about Brexit and Trump and populism, this is not just a story about demographic change, but it's a story about the perception of demographic change, which is driving support for national populism. And then in a third step, the reaction to that from the left, or the progressive left, is reconfiguring our politics. So if you like, what I call the left modernist response to the rise of populism is now creating and hardening this new globalist nationalist, if you like, boundary, which is redefining politics across the West. Really what the book then, Whiteshift, is about are white ethnic majorities across Western countries. And my argument is we need to begin to start an intelligent conversation about white majorities and not just think about them as this toxic thing, because they actually are ethnic groups like any other ethnic group, and the reason they exist is, like with minority ethnic groups, is because of an attachment to symbols, ancestors, etc., and not just to maintain power and oppress. So that is the first important point. The second point I talk about is this notion of what I call ethno-traditional nationalism. Some of you will be familiar with this debate between what's called ethnic nationalism, only members of the ethnic majority can be members of the nation, and civic nationalism, this idea that the nation is a willed thing defined only by constitution and values. What I think is going on with national populism is it's not the ethno-state, the ethnic nationalism, but it's something where people want to have a society that's got a majority and it's got minorities. That is, they want to conserve or protect the ethnic matrix that exists from eroding too rapidly. So it's not about open versus closed, but we need a conversation about faster versus slower. And it seems to me that very often, particularly on the progressive side, there's a tendency to pigeonhole anyone who wants to slow things down as being in that closed box and not with us in the open box. So I'm trying to get away from that open, closed, binary, simplistic way of thinking to a more kind of shades of gray approach. And that is going to be controversial for some. So I do think, in fact, wanting to conserve a particular ethnic matrix or morphology is not a racist thing, it's a conservative thing. And we need to be able to talk about the speed, for example, of immigration. That conversation should be as reasonable as the conversation about tax rates being higher or lower. Immigration rates, higher or lower, should not be shrouded in some kind of toxic miasma. Anyway, so when the term white shift really refers to two phenomena which are both kind of demographic and refer to a lot of the same things Paul talks about. The first is the decline of white majorities. We were really only at the beginning of a process of decline of white majorities, not globally. I mean, as Paul said, this shift between 1950 and the end of our century between Europe and Africa, that's going to be mirrored within Western countries. The country I come from, Canada, for example, is projected to go from something like 80% white today to about 80% white, 20% minority today, to the reverse, roughly 20% white, 80% non-white in 100 years. That gives you a sense of the speed of the change that we're going to be looking at over this century. Now, it's not necessarily going to go as quickly in Britain, but by the end of our century, the white population, not just white British, but white European descended, will be at around the 50% or just below, even in Britain. So this is a change we're entering into, and in this period, I argue, this white shift 1.0, if you want, we're going to see populism and polarization and cultural demographic issues becoming more prominent, and the old economic left-right issues becoming less prominent. We see this in many different countries. We see this in the United States, in Britain, in Europe as well. The axis of politics is shifting, and you can even see it here with the Labour Party and the Conservatives now have the same class composition. Who would have thought that in 1950 when they were radically different? Just shows you that the class economic questions are becoming a bit less important compared to the identity questions. And what I do is I look at a lot of survey data. What we see is that concerns about protecting identity is what is driving right-wing populism in the West. Not left-wing populism, right-wing populism. If you look at Trump's primary victory, if you look at his federal election victory as well, the immigration issue is absolutely the number one reason why people who were former Obama voters or non-voters switched to Trump. None of the other 17 primary candidates were willing to make immigration central to their appeal. And that's just an example. With Brexit, too, we see that immigration, by far, is the most important issue for voters. Matt Goodwin, who's sitting there, has made that point in a great book with Harold Clark. Identity, therefore, and not the economic left-behind argument. The economic left-behind argument is a small part of the story. It is not the main driver of populism, but rather concerns over ethno-demographic change feeding through the immigration issue. The immigration issue is a lightning rod, rather it's a symbol. So when you actually tell Americans about the ethnic changes that are occurring in their country by 2050, they become more likely to support Trump, more likely to support conservative policies. And that's just an example of this sort of identity dynamic, identity insecurity dynamic. I also talk in the book about what I call White Shift 2.0, which is the very long-term melting, what I argue is going to be a large-scale racial melting of minority groups with the white majority, and so that the boundaries of whiteness are actually going to expand. When I say whiteness, I mean boundaries of the ethnic majority will expand to include those of mixed-race background. And this is something that, to some extent, we've seen in the United States. If you look at the absorption of Catholics and Jews into the white majority in the US, that occurs during the 20th century. It takes a long time, and then it suddenly happens very quickly from the 60s to the 1980s. And I would argue something similar is likely if we talk about demographic futures in the West. I think something similar is likely to occur. If you take this country, some of the projections I've done with a demographer at the London, formerly of the London School of Hygiene, show that the mixed race population, which is only going to be at about 2% now, 7% at mid-century, so still pretty low, but then it's 30% of the population by the end of the century, and very quickly it's up to 75. So I think that Whiteshift 2.0 is about this shift in the nature of what it means to be the white majority, and that's long-term, and it will be the answer in many ways to the polarization that is going on now. Last point I want to make is to do really, and there are many other points in this book, is really to do with the relationship between these demographic shifts, populism, and the progressive left, because we're at a moment where progressive left ideology has become relatively, well, extremely powerful within the high culture, within the universities. And what that means is that issues of race have become extremely prominent on the left. So what you've had is that with the ethno-demographic shifts, you've had this populist response, which is a backlash to those shifts. But that's also partly been enabled by the progressive left, which has managed to keep, for a long time, immigration off the table of mainstream party politics. And so pressure built up. In a way, it's like if you have if liquor is not supplied by mainstream outlets, a bootlegger will move in to supply. And this is really where populist entrepreneurs have moved in because the mainstream parties weren't addressing that issue. So progressive left played a role in the rise of populism. Now what's happening is you're getting a reaction from the progressive left to the rise of populism, which is solidifying and hardening this polarization. And that's not just the Democrats in the US calling for the abolition of border control, but it's the rise of the Greens, perhaps even this new independent splinter group here in Britain, which is talking about not being anti-Semitic, not being racist, not being against immigration, is an example of that progressive cosmopolitan strand asserting itself as well. And what that means is that just hardens that division then between the globalist, open, cosmopolitan side and the more populist nationalist side, which I think really will define our politics into the future. And I think I'm going to stop there.
Yeah, excellent. Thank you. You guys don't have to go to up here, so you can just make your comments of a 3 or 4 minute, 5 minute variety. Shall we start with you, David?
Very good.
Stay where you are.
I will be as quick as I can because everybody can intervene. Just say I think this is a really important, interesting issue. And like many of us here, I think demography is the most interesting and productive non-Marxist structural account of changes in society over time. It doesn't explain everything, but it explains a lot, as we see in the books that are now appearing. And I think Malthus, it's good to see Malthus at the centre of the debate, although Malthusian pessimism is out of fashion, I think Malthus is an incredibly important thinker in the tradition of British political economy, and most crucially, he is the missing link between Adam Smith and Charles Darwin. It is a book of popular science because it was reading Malthus that led Darwin to reflect, why on earth is nature so fecund? Why does nature produce so much more than it needs and can sustain? And that was the background to Darwin's theory of evolution. So this is all very important stuff. And I also think that the demographic transition is the most important challenge that any society faces. That surge in the number of young people when your birth rate, when many more children are going to survive to adulthood, And when, as you heard, first of all, that population rises before the birth rate falls. And probably the big geopolitical challenge of the 21st century is indeed going to be Africa. And there's a very lively debate about Africa. I personally think they're going to find it very hard to manage this demographic transition. If you think of Asia as the model example of how it has been done, using this surge in the number of young people to transform your society and turn yourself into a modern economy. And if you regard the Arab Spring as the warning of how to comprehensively mess up a surge of young people, that because of closed labour market, patronage appointment systems, poor education, you cannot absorb them. Sadly, I fear that Africa is going to be more like the Arab Spring than like Asia, but we don't know. This matters for us, and let me now turn to what it means for us, because as well as the demographic transition, we have in the West many sort of minor key versions of this, and of course our post-war baby boom is one example, which meant that we had a surge of young people that itself correlates with the kind of disorder that we associate with large numbers of young people. It's no accident the two surges in our birth rate in 1947 and 1964 matched the two biggest riots in London 21 years later, the Grosvenor riot and the poll tax riot. So when you have a lot of young people and they come into your society, it drives turbulence. And I think one implication for us today is when you look at the situation on some of our tough estates, one of the effects of our housing allocation policies is these have concentrations of young people with very high ratios of young people to adults, completely unlike the rest of society. Now finally, just on identity and identity politics, and there's absolutely no reason why the left should have an exclusive claim on identity politics. Clearly it's an incredibly potent force in politics, and we should not work on the basis that it's always malign. We all have to have some sense of the group to which we belong. The insider-outsider distinction is crucial to identity. I guess for me, and maybe this reveals that I have a picture of Britishness that I don't know whether Eric would agree with it or not. I regard Britishness as associated with a set of institutions and a history less than with an ethnic identity. I think Englishness has got some subliminal remaining ethnic element, but I think Britishness is the outward-looking institutional organization which belongs to people regardless of their ethnic background. And incidentally, I think that's clearly also true of Londoner. And if you look at the polling, there is some evidence to support this interpretation that white people are more likely to describe themselves as English, but being British or being Londoner is far less ethnically linked. So I think that although we don't have the kind of Irving Kristol account of the mission of the US, I do think that Britain historically has got a sense of identity that is less ethnic and more institutional. And one of the things that makes me both a Tory and a patriot is the love of my country through the love of its institutions. That doesn't mean that we can take indefinite levels of migration, but I'm not persuaded that Britishness has an ethnic element to it.
Good.
Well, I first became obsessed with demography when I was 16 years old, when I did a semester-long project in high school. And at that time, Paul Ehrlich had recently published The Population Bomb. Some of you may remember it. And that was a period when the growth rate had really taken off, and it looked as if in no time, if you did your maths, we were all going to be allocated our own little 6-inch square on which we could balance because it becomes exponential. And a lot of people later said, you know, oh, Ehrlich was wrong, population growth is not a problem, his statistics were all off. Well, his statistics were certainly an excessive projection of the present on the future. I've lived through huge changes in the field of demography because demography has changed. One of the big things that differences is the fact that when Ehrlich was writing The Population Bomb, everyone, all countries had a high growth rate. All ethnicities had a high growth rate. Therefore, it was comfortably a global problem. That rapidly changed. The growth rate plummeted in the West and became a third, what was then called third world problem. And that made it politically awkward, because suddenly it wasn't all of us and we're all having too many children. It's those people are having too many children, and many of them were, as we'd say today, people of color. Demography kind of went underground for quite some period. It became uncool to encourage small families in the developing world just because you know, you can't tell these other people what to do. And the argument was all in terms of economics. And it was all in terms of the rights of women. At that time, it was also assumed that large numbers of people in a high growth rate was to your great economic disadvantage. You were hobbling your society with too many people too fast, and they were all going to be poor. They were using up all the resources, whereas we in the West, we were prospering because we had reached a steady state growth. That has changed somewhat. I think that even the field of demography, not to mention sociology, is beginning to accept that numbers confer power. And I think that's one of the things that in the immigration debate, which is of course in perfect lockstep with the field of demography, that's what we have to accept. After all, when you allow people into a democratic country, they get the vote. They get political power. And so the resentment is not just economic for the native born, you know, competing for jobs, but it's also a sense of ceding power and literally ceding territory. And I have been frustrated through the whole, especially during the long shut the fuck up period in relation to immigration, that we're just not fair. We expect the native populations in Western countries to be more hospitable and more generous than I think is biologically natural. And we have to give people a little credit. I mean, frankly, I think that most Western countries have been remarkably tolerant of incredibly high levels of immigration, and I am surprised that the most recent popular backlash has taken so long to manifest itself, because it's been building for a long time. And the truth is, we do not expect from the countries contributing immigration that they display that generosity and hospitality in return. If you come from Somalia, you don't expect a bunch of white people to come into your country. So, and if we did, it would be regarded as an invasion and as a form of colonialism. So I see a lot of double standards in this debate, and I think that's where people get into trouble. That we have to be less judgmental about what I think are some very primitive feelings about being crowded in your own country, and also having to make room for other people. It does require generosity. I thought the most exciting parts of both your books was this whole idea of whiteness and what it is, and the fact that white populations, through intermarriage, are not only going to do in the future, but are already doing right now, absorbing many other different ethnicities. And it raises the question, really, is who's taking over whom? And if we would just get better at selling that message, I think that native Western populations would get a lot more relaxed. And to my frustration, from what I have read, the hard left from the identity politics crowd is very uninterested in this argument, because they love the idea. I mean, these people are very combative, and they love the idea of conquest and the victory of the peoples of color and the diminishment of the horrible white people, and there's even a trace of vengeance in their rhetoric. And this is absolutely the worst way to go about it, and has horrible political consequences. That's it.
Very good. Thank you. Well, thank you very much. I think I'm supposed to give you an example, direct example of white flight. Is David and I are both from Birmingham. He ended up in the Lords and I ended up in the Commons. So there you go. He got to a higher place than I did, if seen that way. If seen that way. I think the issue is a very serious one. And I think if I start from the 70s and the early 80s, of what the pressures have been basically in societies and communities in Birmingham, where you had traditionally working class people, say in my constituency, Lozells, Handsworth, Newtown, those sort of areas, Small Heath is another one adjoining area, Ladywood and those sort of areas, where largely originally a lot of people came in to settle because of the heavy industry that was based there and worked in those heavy industries, because mostly the indigenous community didn't want to start to go back into the foundries and heavy steel mills that existed at the time. Those were eroded in time, and those communities stayed on their own. So when then their families came to join them, that crowded out those little bits of society and community, and therefore you got too much of these people coming in and taking over those societies. What then happened was that the institutions didn't help. When I first got in 2001, there was an organization, which probably still exists, I think, ran by Yasmin Ali Brown, calling itself Global Britons. And the first meeting that I went to as I got elected in the first few months was a thing called post-integration. And I thought, are they talking about the same constituents that I've just been elected in? Are they talking about the same place that I've just been elected in? One of the serious problems that we've had is that we haven't been integrated in communities. Communities have been held up in isolation, therefore isolating from their neighbors, isolating from the wider community that they've been part of. Institutionally, our funding worked in a very wrong way of supporting the Kashmiris, the Sikhs, the Hindus, the Afro-Caribbean, and all those people to help them to move forward. And the more they could prove a case for a bigger community, the more funding they got as community organizations. So it was in their interest to further isolate themselves to move forward, which further isolated the white indigenous communities in those areas who felt totally left out because that funding wasn't applicable to them. We then got different council estates, which remained sink estates essentially in their own rights, because they weren't eligible for some of those fundings to upgrade their communities in such a way. So they became a lot more resentful of what was going on in those communities and those societies. And ultimately, I was door knocking in Tamworth, and somebody came out wearing an Aston Villa shirt. And I said, "Oh, that's great, nice to see you supporting the Villa." He said, "I grew up in Newtown. I grew up there. I moved out there because I couldn't really live there because there's nothing for me in order to associate, to socialize with." Birmingham City is still called Small Heath United. And at the weekend, a huge amount of people come in from outside. There's a huge problem with parking because a lot of people are coming in from outside rather than the local people who used to support those football teams are not there anymore. The West Bromwich Albion, Aston Villa and Birmingham, three football clubs just around Birmingham, more or less in the centre of Birmingham, are three clubs that demonstrate the effect of white flight and those people that have been excluded in those areas. And I think that is an institutional problem that we've had. We've not looked at it. We've not looked at how to integrate people. What we did was more isolation of communities. And that's been a real effect of social policy that were predominantly from the left, whatever we've had, and certainly continued by several governments in relation to that. You can't continue to isolate governments, communities without having that integrational stuff. So I think we're still very weak in the UK in terms of immigration, as opposed to better in isolation, and that's what we've done, that's what we created by and large. And I think the other real issues that have been in terms of trying to deal with this nationalistic issue, which most people try to raise, in terms of what people are now coming out, and particularly in terms of Brexit and what we're dealing with in terms of so-called national fervour. I think it's partly based on issues of xenophobia, where when you had the white population from Eastern Europe coming in, and trying to deal with that. And people felt there's been a huge, if you look at the last few years in the press, there's a huge been anti-Eastern European stories about so-and-so has happened. And there's this one Romanian who's got 11 children and they're all receiving benefit, and he is dealing in scrap metal and he's stealing these sort of things from different people's houses and all sorts of stuff. A huge fervor based on one particular case rather than the contribution the overall Eastern European community that makes in relation to that. And I think what has happened is that this isolation of the indigenous community, indigenous Burmese or whatever we come from in different cities and different areas, has pushed people into an almost xenophobic type of attitude, which has made it very difficult for them to operate. We in the United Kingdom have a growth in population in terms of a mushroom type of figure. If you can look at, we've got the retiring people at the top. And I deal with a huge amount of WASPy women. These are women who've just been told that their pensions are going to increase by another 7 years, up to another 5 years, up to until they're 67, as well as men. It's going to happen. So there's a huge issue with trying to support those people who've now grown older, which are the baby boomers essentially, and need to be supported. And the only way they're going to be supported is if you have more skilled people coming in, contributing at the tax base level, which you don't have. And that's essentially what's happening over Europe, certainly Canada, and certainly in terms of the US, which is what's happening. So these people who are coming in contribute. What we haven't done, sorry, and we're trying to do now at the moment, is in terms of changing our immigration policy, into having skilled labour coming in, which we've based at £35,000. And there's all sorts of argument around what is skilled. Is a carer a skilled person? Is a nurse a skilled person? So what is the value of a skill? Is it in monetary terms, or is in the social value that they give to those institutions? So I think there's still a lot of debate to be had. And I think what we've got to do is to try and challenge and change those discussions in relation to, rather than being a threat, how it supports the overall community and take some of the xenophobia out of it. And I think it's been politically led as well, by and large, whether it's the left or the right, in both instances politically led. And I think what we've got to do is, in order to try and redress that balance, and to do that, certainly intermarriages will have a huge change in relation to that, but that's a slightly long-term issue to look at. But I think we've got to have a balanced debate about this, and I think the two books will contribute hugely to that. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I just want to, very quickly, before we open it up, whether you two would like to respond briefly to some of the points that have been made. David Willetts' point about the kind of the weakness of the ethnic content to Britishness, and perhaps a point for you. I mean, and one might add to that. I mean, something that has always has sort of interested me in this debate. I mean, you know, your claims about the sort of elemental power in some ways of ethnic attachment still. Well, if it is so powerful, how come you can spend 3 years in a Russell Group university and apparently lose all ethnic attachment to your country? I mean, it does seem something remarkably easy to sort of shake off for, you know, the kind of younger progressive classes, as it were. I mean, perhaps they then reacquire it in some way later on in life. But yeah, but perhaps, you know, ethnicity is perhaps not quite the sort of fundament that you often seem to describe it as, and perhaps you might like to respond to some of the things yes. that both Lionel and Khaled have been saying, and perhaps also this point, I mean, yet another book about demography that's also just come out, you know, 3 in a row, this empty planet thesis that actually that depopulation is going to come up on us much more rapidly than most people have assumed. That actually the UN projection for 11, peaking, global population peaking at 11 billion is wrong. It's actually going to peak at 9 billion and start tumbling down. And then a whole lot of issues are going to, a whole lot of other set of sort of problems and issues are going to emerge from that. So perhaps just a brief response to me and to the three respondents.
I'll just very briefly make 3 brief points. So first of all, on the Empty Planet book, which both you and I have reviewed, you in the Times and me in the Toronto Globe and Mail, which, as you know, is the paper that the authors write for, so somewhat constrained to what I said. I think you have to accept there's a huge amount of uncertainty on fertility rates. The big question is, how quickly does sub-Saharan African fertility fall? We know countries like South Africa are well down below 3, heading for 2 at the moment. Big question is really West Africa, where that goes. I think all will hinge on that. Just 2 things David said I wanted to comment on that sort of resonated with me. The first was Britishness versus Englishness. And I am entirely the child of foreign stock with foreign-born parents. And it's certainly the case that my father always said to me, we can be British, but we cannot be English. So that was certainly, whether it's true or not, whether it's, I don't know how you'd prove it or disprove it, but that's certainly what I was brought up to believe. And finally, the other thing that David said, a totally different subject, which I got very excited by, was the link between Malthus and Darwin, quite unrelated to anything else we've talked about. But I think this is very underappreciated. And when he was on the Beagle, but Darwin was reading Malthus and said, Eureka, effectively. And the link is that Malthus was effectively saying human populations constantly push up against, you'll double and double and double again. There's just not the resources. So you'll be banging against this resource possibility. And Darwin said, that's a state of nature. All species are in that condition. And it's because they're all in that parsimonious condition, on the edge of survival, that a small advantage will give you a big advantage, and a small disadvantage will mean you don't have successful offspring. And that is that Malthusian principle, actually applied back to nature, is what guides the whole of evolution. So very unrelated to the rest of our discussion, but a really underappreciated point. So thanks for doing that.
So, Eric, this point about ethnic attachment, and also perhaps Lionel's point about the sort of generosity in some ways of white majorities hitherto, in any case.
Yeah, so I mean, I think it's important that the book really has, there's 2 constructs I'm talking about. One is the nation state, which is the Britishness, if you like, which I argue should be open and people can find their own path through that depending on their ethnic background, etc. And the other is the sort of ethnic layer, the ethnic majority. And one of the findings in psychology is that attachment to in-group is not correlated with dislike of out-group. So except in times of violent conflict. So in the American National Election Study, a white American's warmth towards whites is, if anything, positively correlated towards, with their warmth towards blacks and Hispanics, not negatively, right? And this is not a new finding. So that's one of the fallacies that's put out there. But the second point is, when we talk about Britishness or Americanness or whatever, yes, it is, we have to distinguish, I think, between criteria of membership, which are open and it's just about attachment to a creed, etc., a passport, and properties of the collective. So if you think, for example, of a statement like all accents are British accents, because you don't have to speak with a British accent to be British, and that's true. And so, right, so the actual membership criteria does not include having a British accent, right? But yet, if the British accent was disappearing as a collective property, people would be justified, for example, in wanting to conserve it or prevent its continued erosion. You can't have a complete, you're not going to go for everybody having to have a British accent. But this is sort of an analogy with ethnicity. That is, it is legitimate to say, we want the pace of change to be something we're comfortable with. We hope to be able to assimilate people at a rate high enough to sort of roughly not erode too quickly. But at the same time, you certainly don't have to be white British to be British, just as you don't need to have a British accent. So that's an important distinction, which I think is not always appreciated. And you'll often get people toggling between these 2 levels of the collective and the individual. It's something they call the fallacy of composition. And so I think it is not, in my view, it is part of conservatism, say, to want even the ethnic composition of your society not to change as quickly as it might with rapid change. And it's the same if we were talking about Harlem and the decline of the African-American population in Harlem due to gentrification. And the longtime black residents who don't like that and want to slow it down through zoning or whatever. I mean, it is not a is automatically a xenophobic thing, that it's again about attachment to something you've known rather than hatred and xenophobia and fear as it's often depicted. I think we have to have a reasonable conversation. What is the speed people are comfortable with? I don't think it's right to say that ethnicity doesn't matter at all. I don't think it's right to say we have to have some kind of an ethno-state. That's ridiculous and xenophobic. And that's going down this sort of far right line. But we have to open up a conversation about the cultural impact. And I think that's maybe what Lionel was talking about. And again, we see this, again, in non-Western countries, just as we see it in Western countries, amongst white and non-white groups. And it's just, I think we should.
Well, they're parts of especially coastal Mexico, pretty beach Mexico,
Right.
which have been heavily invaded by white retirees
Right.
from the U.S. The Mexicans hate them.
Right.
They hate them and feel invaded. And from the quotes I've read from the people who live there, with no self-consciousness that there's a little irony there, that some of the immigration is going the other direction. And which is itself an interesting
I think
blindness.
southern Spain would be the equivalent for Europe.
Yeah, it is.
But, you know, just for the sake of the audience, in case everyone doesn't read your book, I thought one of the most interesting points you made was something I wasn't especially aware of, and that is that among minorities, immigrant minorities in places like Britain and the United States, there is a significant degree of attachment to the ethnic majority and to the idea of, say, of Britishness, of the cumulative traditions of Britishness. They don't want to necessarily, say, move to a little Somalia. They want to live in Britain. And the same in the United States.
Well, yeah, that was interesting because they did surveys of Latino and Asian Trump voters who were identical to white Trump voters on the question. And that's about a third of the Asian and Latinos who voted for Trump. And on the question of it's important to preserve and protect the white Christian heritage. They came out a majority in support, just as did the whites. Now, I mean, it's interesting to me that they were at the same level of support for that statement. And again, the way that I would explain this is simply that you don't have to be Cornish to appreciate the Cornish in Cornwall, for example, or the Welsh in Wales. You can want Wales not to lose its Welshness, even if you're an English person who's moved there. And that's the kind of similar dynamic, I think, with the Latinos and Asian, particularly the Trump voters, but that they are attached to the way America is, if you like.
Good. Okay. Well, let's. We've got 10 minutes or so. So let's have some brief comments and contributions from you, the audience. Blue shirt there. Just perhaps say who you are, and then say your piece.
Hi, my name's. Can you hear me? Okay.
Yep.
Ian Craig from Belfast, but occasional resident in southern Spain. I must object to the Canadian gentleman's throwaway line about hostility shown by the Andalusians against the Brits. They're much more concerned about the Catalans.
Right, thanks. Daniel here at the front. Oh, wait. Don't be impatient.
You've talked
What's
a
your
great
name?
deal.
What's your name?
Sorry, Daniel Johnson, editor of The Article, until recently Standpoint. You've talked a great deal about ethnicity and demography. You barely mentioned religion. But isn't that the big story of the 21st century, the thing that wasn't predicted? Everyone, in America especially, is obsessed with race because of the legacy of slavery and so on. But the return of religion to the center of our political debates, and in particular, the tensions, the demographic tensions here in Europe, surely that's a huge subject, which you barely touched on.
And gentleman there, just behind you, check shirt.
My name is Benny Poeser. We've just seen the expulsion of huge communities, Christian communities from the Middle East. Basically, most Christians have been pushed out dramatically. And we are seeing the gradual expulsion of the Jewish communities from Europe. So communities, clearly minority communities, can see what can happen if they lose their place in society and when hostile communities move in. That's what's happening. I think that explains part of the worry. You look at the white communities now in South Africa. They are basically living on a volcano. No one knows what's going to happen to them.
Lady at the end of the row.
Thank you. Ruth Dudley Edwards. I would just like to hear what our friends have to say about the new colonialism, viz. The Chinese moving into Africa. And is Africa being generous, or are they being hoodwinked? This is the question.
Good. Well, let's get a few. Perhaps one there.
Hello. Thanks for some great talks. Jared Lyons. I'm an economist, and as no economics questions have been asked, I thought I would. Given in economics incentives matter, what do you think are the implications for policy? There's lots of examples of countries growing their population successfully. Singapore might be a small country, but it comes to mind. In terms of attracting migrants, what does it imply for benefit system? For instance, should Britain move away from a beverage system to a Bismarckian system based on contributions? Does that what are the economic implications? And in terms of Africa, its working age population is to go up by twice that of India and China combined in the next 16 years. So does that imply that Africa has to naturally move to become far more capitalist in terms of unleashing the potential and economic dividend from population growth? So some of the economic issues that might crop up. Thank you.
Okay, let's have a few comments on the comments.
So I'll cover most of them, forgive me if not all of them. So far as the Andalusians being worried about the Catalonians in Andalusia, you should ask what the Catalonians in Catalonia think about the Andalusians who've come up there. And there's a much longer and bigger tradition of Andalusians coming up to Catalonia, as you know, because it's an industrial area. On religion, of course, Eric has written his book on religion, Shall the Religious Inherit the Earth? I like to think of the demographic transition as demographic modernity. It's modern. You go through a modern process. Religion and its impacts on demography I think of as post-modern. And I think we are entering in many countries the era of post-modern demography, where what will matter is not whether you're in the modern world with availability to contraception, living to 70 or 80, because everyone will be there. The question will be, what are your religious and other ideological views which might drive your fertility rates? And you know, we see that in many communities, and it could be that the Hasidim in New York and the white various Christian movements in the more obscure parts of the United States turn out to be the areas with the fastest growth, while the Latinos in the big cities are rapidly moving towards Western-style fertility rates. So that could be the big surprise in the future. It'll be about culture, it won't be about economics. Coming to the Chinese in Africa, I think that's a really interesting story, but I don't think it's a demographic one, because I suspect that the growth of Africans in Africa is so phenomenal that you would need a very, very large number of Chinese to make a demographic impact. Now, there's another discussion about their political impact, their economic impact, but I don't take them seriously as a demographic element. The Chinese who go to Africa, I suspect it's something like 1 million people in a continent that's rapid. I mean, Nigeria alone is going to be 800 million. So I don't think it's a demographic issue, although I think it's a very important and interesting issue. So finally, on the economics, the way I like to put it is if you're going to have a low fertility rate, if you're choosing to have small families, and if you want a buoyant economy, you've got choices to make as a country. You're either going to have to suffer the economic problems of not having a growing workforce, or you're going to have to deal with the political issues of mass immigration and ethnic change. It's either political or economic problems. People should be able to choose between the two, or have more children.
Do you want to chip in, or
well, I'll just talk a bit about the religion question.
Go on. Go on.
Because it's something that I wrote my last book on, and I think you're absolutely right that one of the things, I mean, as Paul said, in a way paraphrasing, the link between sex and procreation has been broken by contraception. That changes the game entirely, and instead of economics and technology being the factor that determines fertility, it's culture and values. And so into that mix, religion is hugely important. I mean, Bricker and Ibbotson's book, which you reviewed, is all about population decline in the world. But what's interesting is that everywhere in the world, practicing religious groups have replacement or higher fertility, and the what I call closed religious sects, which are world-denying, like the Amish and Hutterites and ultra-Orthodox Jews, their fertility hasn't dropped at all, and in many cases has increased. And so looking ahead, despite the empty planet, actually these groups are going to expand. So if you take the Amish, in my book I talk about, with a doubling time of 25 years, you're talking about 300 million Amish in the U.S. in the 2200s. So now, I mean, and now they've been doing this for over a century. Their growth rate's been at its current rate. But if you look at Israel with the ultra-Orthodox, I mean, the ultra-Orthodox are going to be the majority of observant Jews in America and Britain.
Isn't there an element of the deliberate about that? I mean,
could be. It could very well be.
I think it's political. I think it's.
Right.
I think that is the intention.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think it's hard to know whether it's just because of their pronatalist theology and scholar society model, or whether it is deliberate. But the result, anyways, they will take over Israel, and
Brooklyn.
And Brooklyn, which, by the way, if you look at Trump voting in Brooklyn, it's the ultra-Orthodox.
Maybe.
Yeah, and then I do apologize, I'm going to have to go. But just one comment on Gerald's question, because there is a paradox here, that the societies which apparently support high levels of high birth rates, traditional roles for women, when those women can also access control over their contraception, have incredibly low birth rates. The worst scenario is to try to impose traditionalist values in a modern society with access to contraception. However, the societies that have very liberal labour markets, where you can, I used to say, you used to be able to, the busy two-earner couple in London shops at hours that are probably illegal in many parts of the continent of Europe, and where you can combine work and childcare. The countries with flexible labour markets that enable women to work are also the ones that have the higher birth rate. And this in turn creates some other tension. It means that and those type of countries that have flexible labour markets are also countries into which migrant labour can more easily slot. So high birth rates and high rates of migration go together. And the countries that have highly regulated, highly structured labour markets both have low birth rates and also an environment where it's harder for migrants to work. Plus, as a result of their low birth rate, where the indigenous population feels on the defensive, they have migration as more of a threat. So and I think this may be a small point to think before. So actually, I think high migration, flexible labour markets, high birth rate go together. Low birth rate, highly regulated labour markets, low rates of migration, hostility to migrants go together, which is not quite what people expected.
So, do you think, David, that it's more important in some ways, in the context of the Brexit vote, a lot of people say that Brexit will lead to a diminishment of the kind of power and authority of the United Kingdom. But if our population is increasing much faster, Germany is shrinking, so we're going to overtake Germany in population terms. We're going to be, what, 75 million in another 30 years or so? Germany is going to fall below that. So actually, any loss of power and authority in the world through Brexit will be more than compensated for by our larger population. Yes?
Well, I think, for me as a shameless old Remainer, I always thought one of the peculiarities of the British debate was on the European Union's own forecast, Britain became Europe's biggest country and biggest economy. That's the route we were on. We were manifestly, the exact crossover date was debatable, but we were manifestly going to have the largest number of workers, and provided we were reasonably productive, there was some point in the 2040s to 2050s when we were going to be a bigger economy than Germany's. We are on our route, and I know Daniel, this is one of the endless exchanges I have with Daniel, who thinks of Europe as a German sort of plot or something, but I always, he's worried about German power in Europe. I would say Britain has not just become Europe's business capital, it was on its point, on the route to becoming Europe's biggest economy as well. Yeah.
Yeah, but
the point is that Brexit is going to be less relevant than our demographic projections, which are not going to be affected by Brexit, I wouldn't have thought, in any significant way. Paul, I mean, how would you see?
Well, the difference Brexit will make, will be we will of course be able to determine our own immigration policy, which makes me sound like a sort of dyed-in-the-wool Brexiter, which I'm not. So we will then have to determine what sort of immigration policy we want. But I would point out that Britain has absorbed and economically enjoyed huge migration from Eastern Europe, and that is going to dry up anyway, partly because of the shift in Eastern Europe economy, but more so because the number of Poles in their 20s is just dropping like a stone. And Bulgarian becoming 20s, even if we let them.
You know, for all this talk about, oh, we'll finally have control of our borders and we can set our own immigration policy, I am personally not convinced, given the size of the forces that Paul's book talks about, that the UK government has the capacity to control it. I agree Brexit's not going to make any difference, because you're dealing with large populations of people who are highly motivated in terms of their own survival, and they're going to go where they want.
Well, I've been influenced by Eric on this, who always gives the example of Singapore. There you have this tiny island, incredibly prosperous, surrounded by huge numbers of people who are not doing badly, but they're a hell of a lot worse off than the Singaporeans. And they do have reasonably high immigration in Singapore, but you don't get into Singapore if they don't want you there. So I think it's a question of choice. I think we do have the choice. That's not to say it will be easy. But I think we have the choice, and we need to make the choice, and we need to implement that choice, and I do think it's possible. I think it's defeatist to say if we didn't want immigration, we're going to have it anyway.
Good. Well, thank you. Can we just say a big thank you to everybody on the platform? Thank you.